certain truths that we have come to accept without questioning may not be our truth. Hey guys, this is Coach KP, and today I am going to talk about something that I've been reflecting over for the last 3 to 4 weeks. The events that started with the death of George Floyd and, the protests and the riots that followed and all of the racial dialogues that we've been having in this country since. Racial dialogues have always been kind of the fabric of, or at least the undertone of American socioeconomic problems. But I think the death of George at the hands of the police officers and, all of what has happened has really sparked the conversation to a whole unprecedented level. And I think there is no one that hasn't been affected or hasn't heard about this, at least in the United States today. So as I was reflecting on what has happened and why there still seems to be kind of a resistance to completely accept the fact that racism does exist. I know majority of the people, especially people that organize and go into these protests, have acknowledged that, but there's still, especially on the internet, there seems to be a lot of kind of deflection, focusing on on just the riots and not necessarily on the fact that police brutality even exists in our society and racism even exists in our society. So as I've been reflecting on this, I'm starting to find that the concept of ancestral trauma or transgenerational trauma, as they call it in psychology, is a real thing. And when we talk about transgenerational trauma, it generally only kind of addresses the victim side of transgenerational trauma. Let's say, for example, alcoholism can also be seen as generational trauma, and addiction can be seen as generational trauma. So we can look at the person that is addicted or is an alcoholic, in this case, a victim of whatever's went on in their ancestry up to that point. Maybe their parents was addicted to certain substances. Maybe they were abusive. Maybe there was a lot of mental health issues in that family, and then that kind of cascaded down to this person. And the interesting fact about ancestral trauma is many native cultures believe that, especially the South American, North American native shamanic cultures, always believe that by healing yourself, by that person that is addicted, or in this case the alcoholic, by healing themselves, they are able to release that trauma, cascading back all the way to the source of the trauma. So by healing your addiction, you're also healing the addiction of your past, your ancestors, your past generation, which is a fascinating concept in and of itself. Okay, so tying that back into sort of this denial of the fact that racism exists in this current society, what has happened is that the group of people that have generally been in the side of the oppressors or have lineage to the oppressors, and I'm not saying this as an umbrella statement or every single one whose ancestors have been involved in racism is a racist right now. That's not what I'm saying. I'm also not trying to label people as racist for necessarily having a differing view. That's not where I'm going. But what I'm trying to address here is the blatant acts of denying, deflecting, turning the other cheek, even when something very unjust is happening in front of our eyes. Okay, so that specific case is what I'm addressing with this video today. And it's also meant to be an open dialogue. I would love to hear on the comment section if somebody differs from, what my views are. And my views are a culmination of all of the things that I have seen in terms of racism, all of the things that I have read and experienced in terms of healing ancestral traumas. Okay? it may be limited. I'm open to that. So this is meant to be an open dialogue. Let me go back to my point, saying how the group that have been traditionally involved in racism, maybe there is a social vow or a societal conditioning that has gone into this group where they say that we don't associate with a certain group. We don't associate with a certain, person that looks a certain way, or is a certain race, or has a certain belief. It could be many number of things, okay? So if we are a descendant of that lineage, it would be very interesting for us to reflect back as the group that has always or traditionally been the oppressor. Traditionally, in this case, in the case of racism, would be traditionally have a racist background. Although these are not pleasant things, right? These are not things that we care to admit. I have a ton of ancestral things that I bring to this life, and I'm constantly working through that. And I think a lot of us are doing that. It's hard. It's not something that's very pleasant and great to admit, because this is shadow work. Okay, so what I'm saying is, if we belong to this group that has traditionally been the oppressor, we have ancestral trauma, and this doesn't get talked about a lot in areas such as therapy, or even in shamanic healing. The focus is really on the oppressed or the victim, so to speak. So if we have been a part of a group that has been in the situation or in a condition of privilege, we have inherited ancestral trauma. Because if we look at how a child is before they've been heavily conditioned by the beliefs of their parents, a child is really not racist. A child is probably the epitome of unconditional love. And I'm sure some folks will point me to a fringe case and say that I may be wrong, which is fine. But majority of the children that are born and between the age of 1 and 3, I have not met, and I have met a ton of little kids in my extended family, and nieces and nephews and that kind of stuff. So it's still limited, but I have not seen anyone acting in a racist or a biased way. Let's say, okay, let's not even talk about racism when you talk about these kids. They really have no bias. They're just so curious and always, wanting to experience this world through their little hands and feet, right? So when we're children, we don't have some of these very strong sentiments, or we are very kind to the suffering of others. But somewhere along those lines, the ancestral trauma that we bring to this world gets triggered, whether it's by societal conditioning or by the messaging of our parents or of the tribe that we belong to. There is a lot of tribes even in this modern day world. We have to kind of acknowledge that. And when there is no tribe, we tend to kind of find our own tribe. And in the United States, I find it funny that we have managed to create these football teams that have very tribal sounding associated names, such as Minnesota Vikings or Buffalo Bills. It's a very tribal pack herd type of deal where we are this team, and now that becomes ancestral trauma. I mean, look at people that worship a particular football team generation after generation after generation, and it really triggers them. Especially we see this in Europe, where soccer teams have such ancestral sort of a conditioning that if you're an Arsenal fan, chances are your whole lineage will be an Arsenal fan, and there are bloody battles that happen in the United Kingdom and in parts of Europe because we identify so heavily with a particular soccer team. It sounds very frivolous, but this is real. The association is real. And what I'm saying is that these are all ancestral. Okay? So then if we have been traditionally an oppressor, and I can also talk a little bit about the caste system in India, South Asia. I come from Nepal. I was in a position of privilege where I had not experienced the caste system as I was growing up so much, because I had friends from all caste, creed, and religion, because of how diverse the place that I grew up in was. But later I have come to terms with that, and I also deflected the fact that there was oppression happening to many different groups of people, and I've come to a realization that actually maybe there is institutional ancestral trauma that is still there. So in personal development and in self-help communities, we put a lot of emphasis on victims or the oppressed to kind of take the power back, right? And we have multiple things that we do to take power back, and be seen as worthy and not as the victim, not as the traditional victim, in order to heal our ancestral trauma, or the trauma that got passed down to us by how our parents and their parents viewed themselves as a victim or as a oppressed. Similarly, if we have been the oppressor, and self-reflection has to go in to even understand if we've been in a position of privilege. And again, this is not easy work. But if we have been the traditional oppressor, we have to understand that trauma is affecting us as well. And then it becomes our journey to heal, because once you realize that certain truths that we have come to accept without questioning may not be our truth, may not be who we are at the core. So that's where our work is to understand our privilege, understand our biases, understand the ancestral trauma that we bring into this world, and unconsciously roll it out. Okay, so that's my message for today. A slightly different take on ancestral trauma and how the oppressor is also going through the same or similar trauma, at least from the concept perspective, that a victim may be going through, and both sides need to heal for us to come to balance. One side can heal to try to not see themselves as a victim, but when the other side hasn't healed or isn't aware of the ancestral trauma that they bring into this world, it becomes an uphill battle. And I think we can all help each other by not shaming, by not blaming, by not criticizing, but by being understanding of the fact that ultimately we are all hurting, and ultimately all of us can come into terms with the fact that we are going through some things that we can heal. Okay, that's my message for today. Coach KP, peace.